A little bit about me. Let's get started. I moved to this state just a few years ago in 2017 and joined Green River this past September. I will be facilitating today's workshop on information behavior, inclusive pedagogy, and how these ideas can influence our teaching practice in an online environment during the pandemic. Some announcements before we begin. I'd really like to thank Green River's Instructional Diversity Council for this opportunity to share my knowledge and understanding with you all. If you would like to learn more about the IDC at Green River and this amazing workshop series, then I'd highly recommend reaching out to Michael Moreno and Maricela Fletesler. They are the co-chairs of this committee, and they do truly great work in ensuring diversity and equity in our instructional practices. Not only that, I'd especially like to thank Jody Siegel, another librarian at Green River, and you might see her face in the gallery view. She's another member of the IDC, and she's the one who invited me and guided me through this whole process. Not only that, she is my chat monitor today, and she's my support for this Zoom session, so I thank you so much. And I want to thank all of you as well. Thank you for being here today. I saw a lot of moods in the chat. I saw a lot of positivity and a lot of, feelings of overwhelm, feelings of anxiety, and I feel that. We're all in this together, right? So, this session, just for you guys to know, this session will be recorded. The chat will not be part of the recording. So if you'd like to save the chat, I believe you can do so individually. You can do that by looking in your chat window. There is a small 3-dot icon right above that text box where you type in your messages. And there should be an option to save the chat file. But if you cannot save it for whatever reason, you can always email me. My email is on this slide, and it's going to be on the ending slide as well. It's achin@greenriver.edu. And my plan is to upload this recording onto YouTube and send out the link to all the listservs that I had originally sent the workshop invitation to. So if you received the invitation from someone else other than me, please email me, and I can always send you the recording link. With that said, let's get down to it. First, I want to thank everyone who shared their reflections. I know we're all coming from many different places and spaces, both physically and emotionally today. Oh, yes, so I see a question in the chat. Yes, so this is being recorded. So if you would like to put your name, or you can always change your name on the gallery view as well. So if you see your video and you see your face, then there is, if you hover over your video screen on the 3-dot icon, it's a little blue button. You have the option of changing your name or doing anything like that. So yes, it is being recorded. So yeah, thank you for everyone who shared their reflections in the chat. We're all coming from very different spaces, so I really wanted some time for us to center ourselves and gather our thoughts. It really helps me get a sense of the room, get a glimpse at what led everyone here. I hope others found it really interesting as well. We're all in this conversation together. And, one thing I really noticed is everyone was there's a lot of feelings of overwhelm. So first, I also want to acknowledge that we made it. At least at Green River, it is week 7, I think. It's hard to know. Time flies. And, we made it through. And that has been amazing. I think we've all done such a great job doing that. So first, take a deep breath and know that you did a great job so far. And we're here to just kind of reflect and move on from now, right? So here's where I'm coming from to be with you all today. On a personal level, I identify as Chinese American. I am second generation on my mother's side. My mother immigrated to this country from Taiwan when she was 9 years old in 1969. So she's 1.5 generation. On my father's side, I am 5th or 6th generation. We're not actually sure. While my mother's father came here as an international student, my father's family migrated to America as Chinese laborers. And I have the lived experience of being a woman of color, as well as being part of a family that is seen as newcomer immigrants to this country, despite the fact that my father's side has been here for longer than many Europeans. Not only that, I too have experience as a privileged migrant. I lived in Tokyo in Japan for 4 years as a university and high school teacher. And I come today with some experiences as a foreigner who has faced another country's immigration policies and cultural perceptions of newcomers. So that's kind of a good segue into my professional life. Currently, I am a faculty librarian and have a master's in library and information science from the University of Washington. I will be sharing some of my research interests with you all today from that field, including information-seeking behaviors and the affective impact on someone seeking help or not. Prior to this career, I earned an MA in Second Language Studies from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And I spent roughly 7 years teaching in a range of contexts, from an intensive English program in Hawaii to EFL in English literature in Tokyo, and immigrant and refugee English in Seattle. So through all of these teaching contexts, there is a connecting thread, which has been my drive to design instruction with inclusion in mind. And I started this out by actually investigating the erasure of queer identity in ESL curriculum. For example, research shows that many migrants come to Western countries to be in safe queer communities. Also, it's guaranteed to have queer or questioning identities in our classroom, regardless if the country accepts that identity or not. So when we think about that in terms of the vocabulary we include in our textbooks, why is that experience not there? You know, why, when we teach family units, do we teach husband, wife, I have 2 children, and so on, rather than teaching phrases such as partner or adopting a child, things like that? This kind of question extended itself when I moved to Seattle, and the learning community I had went from Japanese high schoolers to East African refugees. And again, I looked at the already created curriculum out there and I asked, you know, why did we not teach phrases such as single mother? Or I would spend hours searching for a variety of families to include in my worksheets, and I would spend hours again searching for the Black and brown faces that my students identified with. And this is just one example of the digging I did in terms of inclusive pedagogy and representation in the curriculum. Other tangents I've explored have been in student engagement research, in language learning. So what motivators drive students in Japan, who are often seen as reticent and who are used to this very top-down teaching approach, to actually speak up in a class discussion. And I would spend a lot of time designing activities around this kind of willingness to communicate construct, paying attention to the emotional well-beings of my students as they face their anxieties of making mistakes in a second language. So I journeyed, you know, to be honest, actually, I journeyed through all of this teaching without actually knowing what inclusive pedagogy was at first. It wasn't until I started my MLIS degree at UW that I was introduced to this concept, as well as pedagogical frameworks such as culturally responsive teaching and the writings of some greats such as Bell Hooks and Paulo Freire. And I couched these ideas in other concepts that I would read about, such as critical race theory, or Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality, or Gloria Andelzuo's borderlands, right? And once I discovered one voice, I just couldn't stop digging. I love listening and reading to these ideas. And that's why I kind of wanted to share this in this workshop today, is many of the ideas are the ones that are coming. They have paved the path for me in my understanding of equity-minded education. And I want to celebrate these influencers in my life, as well as ideas that I've added to this conversation on my own. So as I dove deep into DEI pedagogy, I paralleled this with information studies research that was part of my librarianship identity. I began to see what connections between what we know about human behavior and information seeking and what we know about equity in education. In both of these worlds, there's a focus on and recognition of the human being in front of us. Through our recognition of the identities in our information and learning spaces, we can make intentional decisions in our practice as educators. So that's kind of where I'm coming from today. So this is my vision for today. I want to do a little bit of talking and a little bit of Q&A and a lot of group activity, hopefully. I have some files that I would like to share with you all. And if we're limited on time, these are some things that you can take with you. So I'm doing a lot of like big ideas in my talk, and hopefully in the group activity, we're going to do some brainstorming and really bringing that down to applying it to some teaching practice. So at this time, let me copy these links into the chat and try and access them for yourself. Right now, there are just two documents. There is a presentation, so you can see my slides, and there is a resource list. So I'll give you a minute, and if you're not able to access it, let us know in the chat. Or if you are able to access it, let us know that as well, so I can see. Oh, perfect. And I'm sorry, I'm going to be constantly moving my bangs due to sheltering. Haven't gotten a haircut in a long time, so I'm going to probably be doing this a lot. Awesome, so it looks like people are starting to get it. Okay, and another thing to think about as well with Zoom, we almost have like two conversations going at once. We have this one in person where we're like talking, and during Q&A we'll be talking right here, right? But we'll also have this chat. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to add them to the chat. There will be time, hopefully at the end of each like talking bit, where Jody will bring in questions. And I see there are some people who cannot see them. So I think, Jody, if you wouldn't mind working with Maricela about that. If you do have questions, you can always raise your hand in the chat as well. And that's easy for Jody or me to see. And to do that, you just need to click on participants on the bottom menu of your screen. And you should see a list of all the participants here. If you want to raise your hand, at the very bottom menu, you'll see these icons for yes, no, go slower, go faster, and more. If you click on more, you should be able to, you have a couple of options to raise your hand, do a thumbs up, thumbs down, or clapping, or anything like that. So feel free to use any of those. So if you see the, whoops, I put go faster, sorry. I just did a thumbs up right here. So if you can see that in the participant window, that's the goal. So that's another way if you do have a question, and when it comes to, you know, a Q&A time, we can kind of look at that and be like, who has questions? Otherwise, throw things into the chat and we'll try our best to like make sure everyone has a voice here. And there's also group activities, so that will be another place too, right? Okay, so let's try it real quick. Are there any questions before I begin on information seeking behavior? Everyone's pretty good. Okay. Awesome. Well, if there are no questions for now, let's rock and roll. Yes, let's do that. If you do have questions, as I'm thinking, I'm going to probably do a info dump. So as I'm sharing a bunch of info, it takes a while to process, right? So as you're processing, as you're thinking, and you're like, oh, 10 minutes ago, I now have formulated this tangible question in my head. Feel free to add that into the chat. At any time, we can engage with that, right? So I'm going to move forward. Let's talk about information seeking. So let's talk about what actually goes first into this action or this process of seeking information. In library and information science, we spend a lot of time thinking about the mental and emotional processes a person goes through to seek and find information. This is something we study as reference librarians who we want to support learners during our conversations with them. And even prior to that, as learners are coming to our desk, we want to try to anticipate the various thoughts and feelings that learners have that motivate them to reach out to us or not. So there's a lot of research done on the what, the why, and the how of a person seeking information. For example, we know that among the stages a person goes through to start seeking information, that person first must recognize a need for information and accept the challenge to take action to fulfill the need. And these sub-activities are primarily cognitive and affective, respectively. So the idea first, it's so important for us to recognize the information need. That's happening up here in our brains, right? But then we also need to get the motivation to challenge ourselves and to take action to actually seek out that information. That's happening within here in our feelings and our anxieties, right? In educational psychology and in studies on academic help seeking, we also know a couple other things, right? So we know that students are often seeking help in two different ways. Either they are doing some executive help seeking, which means that they're asking someone else to execute the task for them. And this fosters a kind of dependence on help providers. But there's also instrumental help seeking, which is when a student is trying to do a task or solve a problem on their own, and they seek information to help them gain a mastery to do this independently. So this type of help seeking supports a student in becoming an autonomous learner. And studies show that executive help seeking and avoiding help, as you may guess, negatively correlates with academic performance, while instrumental help seeking has a positive correlation. So on top of that, we have this idea of self-regulated learners, and self-regulation is one of the aspects found to encourage instrumental help seeking in students. If a student is a self-regulated learner, they're able to, number one, become aware of their own lack of understanding or information need. They're also able to formulate a request or question and decide who to ask. They're able to ask in a manner that's appropriate to their situation or context. And they're able to utilize this help to master this task and optimize their chances of success when they seek help in the future. So what this all tells us is that being aware of of one's own information need is kind of half the battle, and many students may not be aware that they need help. And if they are aware, they may not be comfortable or practiced in seeking help in a way that will help set them up for success in the long run. So another aspect of information behavior that we can think about is the relationship between the information seeker and the information provider. So in academic settings, we have like the information seeker could be a student, and the information provider could be the instructor or a librarian or a student services staff member, any of those things, right? One model that tries to combine our understanding of an individual's information seeking process with the greater communication activity that happens while we do that information seeking is this Robson and Robinson's 2013 model. I'm sorry, the image on the slide is very not accessible. It is, when I was digging around in my slides, in my files, sorry, this was the best one that I could find. But in the resource list that I shared with you all, there is the article and citation. So you can find the article yourself, and the image is a little clearer in there. Check it out. Some examples that I really liked from, there's a lot of different activities, a lot of different communication that's happening between information providers and information users. But a couple examples I really like from this model is about how information providers may communicate with users either proactively or reactively, right? And we want to be thinking about ways that we're providing information or supporting information, right? Also thinking about how users make choices in evaluating, using, or ignoring the information that they received. And those are choices that people make, right? So it is possible that people avoid information. Another theory I really like is Derwin's 1998 sense-making theory, and I think it's really good for this context. There's a lot to unpack in that theory, but a couple of ideas that I think are relevant for us today is this idea that information is not simply born. It's a product of human observation. It's a product of the way we make sense of things, right? So the information objects such as assignment instructions or even information tools such as Canvas, all of those are things that we make sense of, right? And we make sense of these things through our past experiences and through our feelings. Not only that, information seeking is then, not just a matter of like transferring knowledge from one person to another. It's a constant construction and reconstruction of world sense, right? So we're constantly engaging with other people to make the same sense out of some information. Then once sense is made, it is not static. So sense must be made and unmade with new situations. And unmaking can sometimes be even harder. We build up all of this sense and understanding of something, and then you get thrown into a new situation and you have to kind of unmake all of that meaning that you had created and kind of develop a new understanding. And that's especially pertinent now because we are in a pandemic in the online environment, and that's a very, very new situation for both instructors and for students. And so really being aware that there's new senses, that new sense making that needs to be happening. Whew. So then the other thing that we want to think about, now that we have all of this thinking about the information landscape, we want to think about why do students seek or not seek help, right? There is a lot of research. When we know that, so for example, let's see. A big influencer on someone seeking help or avoiding help is the emotions that they feel. Here is one table that I like. Savolainen in 2014 published this good review. And it shows the range of positive and negative emotions that help motivate a person to either seek help, stop seeking help, avoid seeking help, all of those different behaviors. But essentially, we know that students do often avoid help seeking for a variety of reasons. On the positive side, at least positive emotionally for them, they may feel that they want to be independent, so they choose not to seek help. But on the negative emotion side, there is also a fear of being perceived as not competent or not belonging, and a fear of being stereotyped. And we'll talk about this a little more later, especially with minoritized students. And in the case that a student who does have all this fear, if they do decide they must get help anyways, they may rely only on executive help. So thinking about getting the task solved as quickly as possible, right? They may want to push past the anxiety as fast as they can. So therefore, they're not really thinking about mastery of skills. They're just thinking about how do I just get someone to do the citation for me, for instance, right? And finally, we come to our current situation. We have an online environment, a very, very online environment. Research shows that it actually changes information seeking behavior that students have. We know from research that students, even when given the option of email or chat in a normal situation, they usually prefer face-to-face because it helps build their confidence and it's for comfort. And when they do use online help, they often over-rely on it for executive help seeking. So they use online help a lot for like these quick fixes, right? We also know that, well, I mean, I hear a lot of stories from faculty members about them getting lots and lots of emails from different students for problems or fixes or solutions for things that maybe they could have sought the information on their own, or it was in the syllabi, or there was a discussion board of some kind. And a lot of that is kind of the practice that we have already, our intuition to use online help for executive help seeking. Then there's also this study here, Young, Taylor, and Toe in 2016, where they look at asynchronous online instruction. And they show that students are more likely to seek executive help online because of less fear of looking stupid in front of others, so they don't get that peer pressure in one way. However, they're also more likely to seek executive help online because of more fear of doing worse than others. So there's peer pressure, but it's happening two ways. There's actually a growing body of information and help seeking research in an online environment, and it's showing a lot of like really nuanced complexities. So this is one example of that. There's also, this study also showed that students are less likely to seek help due to feelings of isolation and anxiety. So they feel even more distant from their instructor and their fellow students in this asynchronous environment. And they're also less likely to seek help when online instructions are minimal or do not scaffold. So if they're just kind of floating around and they're not really sure of how to make sense or where to even start, they might not even be willing to reach out and engage. And all of this kind of comes down to this idea that as instructors in an asynchronous online environment, it is vital for us to be able to support the development of self-regulation in students, right? So there's a lot of ideas here, and some ideas that I took from all this to help inform our teaching practice is one, we need to be supporting the learning of instrumental help seeking and self-regulation. And how do we do that? What teaching strategies do we have to do that? So what teaching strategies do we have to help students get into the practice of deciding who to ask, drafting different ways of asking a question, formulating their question in a way that's appropriate to a genre or a context, right? Then what are other ways, how can we provide explicit instruction on when and how to seek that help? Like what kinds of examples are we already using to show these procedures and concepts? How can we practice these routines with students? Do we want to take the time to engage students in some self-reflection so that they can kind of bring these strategies to being, right? So those are some questions that I think about a lot. That is my first round of information. Let's take a quick breath. I'm seeing a lot of comments in the chat, which is awesome. We are going to be doing a group activity next. Before that, I want to give everyone a minute to process a little bit. And let's see, are there any questions or thoughts so far that people would really like to share outside of the chat? If you have something you'd like to share in the recording, raise your hand. So once again, you can do that in the participants window. And if you're in the participants window, you can click on more in that menu options with the yes, no, go slower, go faster. If you click on more, there should be an option to raise your hand or clap or do some kind of symbol like that. So I see Michael has a question. Do you want to? Yeah.
Yeah, hi. So I appreciate seeing the varied ways that students are coming to the technology, especially currently going on with the online environment, an environment that will probably continue into the fall. Um, so I guess part of my situation is trying to recognize that there's so many different conditions that are going on, and we're learning conditions, case by case, even students telling us, but it's also the students who are not telling us.
Mm-hmm.
So my struggle has always been to try to cast a net wide enough to kind of capture all of these things at once without having to, I guess, perpetually jump off my ship and get down into the net and constantly like repair or release or things like that.
Right.
Um, so it's, for me personally, it's trying to strike a balance of being able to cast the net wide enough, but not so wide that it's so vague, but at the same time, again, I don't want to personally go crazy, trying to micromanage all the individualized situations. So I don't know, sort of
Mm-hmm.
feel caught up in trying to kind of construct something. I do a lot of scaffolding. I bring
Mm-hmm.
a lot of research into my classes, work with Jody Siegel a lot. Um, but again, still, especially I've noticed it more this quarter, just trying to maintain all of that and to keep things moving along.
Yeah, I think that idea of making this sustainable for us as instructors too is very real. Um, Two things. So essentially what I've seen that has worked well now, and I put in the resource list a bunch of different very current webinars where people are sharing more practical teaching ideas, and a couple that I've really liked all focus on this idea of a learning community. And we I'll talk about that a little more in the second section, but um, for example, if you have a FAQ discussion board on Canvas, uh, let's see, Shelley Rodrigo in her webinar talked about how not only did she have the FAQ discussion board, she also had, she told students what it was, how to interact with it. And then she also, every single time in the very first 2 weeks that a student asked her or emailed her a question privately, she took off the personal identifying information and she would copy and paste it into the discussion board. And then she would respond to it there. And then she would tell the student, I responded to your question on the discussion board, to get them into the practice of using the discussion board. And she said, over the course of the quarter, what happens is that students start answering each other's questions and they develop this kind of community. And so that was just her way of getting the practice. As you said, widening the net, but also making sure not to constantly be repairing those holes. Another that I found that was really good, so Dr. Ortiz in the Center for Urban Education, one thing that she does is she has these kind of dance party study halls over Zoom, where she puts on some music and she makes it very consistent. So every Monday from 6 to 8 p.m., she opens up a Zoom room, she has some music going, and she's like, just study with me. And she's just there, and students can come and they can bring their homework and do their homework, whether it's for class or not. And as they're there and building this community and talking about music, they're also having the chance to ask questions and things like that. So that's like a one other small example that I've thought of. Um, yeah, there's a lot of really cool teaching strategies, and those are two that really I thought about when I thought about like sustainable things. And I see people are like dance party study halls. That's that's awesome. Are there any other questions before we move on? Okay. So now that we've thought about things, what I want to do is we're going to try this. I want to do a group brainstorming activity. So first, I'm going to post a link to the chat. And I think Michael's question, I'm seeing a lot of people in the chat as well talk about, it is difficult to think about engagement because, sometimes we try a lot and, you'll still get silence or you still get information avoidance, and that happens. So right now, what I want to kind of focus on is what are some small practices we can do about that. So I put a link in the chat. Yes, so question. So the way this is going to work is you are going to be put into breakout rooms, and your breakout room should have a number. So that is your group number. The very first slide has some topics you can think about. And the goal of this is to share ideas, teaching practices, and resources, both within your group as well as the larger participants. So everyone is going to be able to access these slides. So this is a way for us to kind of generate some ideas. If you end up having a ton of ideas and one slide is not enough, feel free to make another one and just, write your group name at the top. Yeah. Are there any last questions you can either share in the chat? Oh, how long do we have? Good question. So I am going to have this for 10 minutes. And we will give you a 5-minute warning, and we will put it, unfortunately, the Zoom announcements are very small and they should come up at the very top of your window as a small blue box. If you miss it, totally okay, because what happens is at the 10-minute mark, we are going to put you on a 60-second timer, and there's going to be a big box that shows up on your screen, and it will automatically bump you back to the main screen. So you don't have to worry about going over time. We will be facilitating that. But you will have about 10 minutes to get to know each other and talk about ideas. Okay. With that said, Jody, you ready? I think so.
Yeah.
Here we go. Is that better? There we go. I apologize. Okay. And I realized some people had to leave at 1, so I apologize. So, okay, let's make some sense together. So I threw a bunch of stuff that I use to make sense of things. And there's just so many big concepts in this idea of inclusive pedagogy and that kind of thing. So here's one that I've kind of latched onto recently, which is that inclusive pedagogy is an approach that aims to make learning as accessible and welcoming to all students as possible. It offers a critique of what is sometimes called a deficit approach. The deficit approach assumes or demands that disadvantaged or marginalized students put in extra effort to get any additional support they need beyond the classroom. By contrast, inclusive pedagogy seeks to embed equitable access and opportunity for success within the classroom and curriculum. So things that this definition does not say, but through my reading and my thinking, for me, at its core, inclusive pedagogy is learner-centered. It is culturally responsive. It is equity-minded. And above all those things, it's intentional. So we need to be intentional in the things that we design and in the things that we teach. So I think if I'm talking about making sense, I think learner-centered and being intentional are some things that we can make sense of, but two concepts that I really want to talk of that I want to make sense of together is this idea of being culturally responsive and being equity-minded. So there's some big block quotes here. I'm just going to take a couple of moments to read them because these are some words that have really influenced my way of viewing education. The first on the left is from Bell Hooks, from their book, Teaching to Transgress. And they say, as they're observing their teaching, they say, as I worked to create teaching strategies that would make a space for multicultural learning, I found it necessary to recognize what I have called in other writing on pedagogy, different cultural codes. To teach effectively a diverse student body, I have to learn these codes, and so do students. This act alone transforms the classroom. The sharing of ideas and information does not always progress as quickly as it may in more homogeneous settings. Often, professors and students have to learn to accept different ways of knowing, new epistemologies in the multicultural setting. Then thinking about culturally responsive teaching, Geneva Gay writes, feelings are important, but culturally responsive caring as an essential part of the educational process is much more. Teachers who really care for students honor their humanity, hold them in high esteem, expect high performance from them, and use strategies to fulfill their expectation. So there's this idea that no matter the student, so we often have, lower expectations of students with Black and Brown identities. We often have this implicit bias that they can't do enough, right? So holding them to this high performance expectation and using strategies, working hard to make intentional strategies to help them fulfill those expectations that we place is part of one of the tenets of culturally responsive teaching. And then finally, from Dr. Benjamin, who is a current equity-minded educator, for them, equity and equity-mindedness accept that it is whiteness, not the achievement gap that produces and sustains racial inequality in higher education. The authentic exercise of equity and equity-mindedness requires explicit attention to structural inequality and institutionalized racism, and demands system-changing responses. So there's some things to really think about as we're thinking about this. Now, those are some ideas that influenced me in terms of how that connects to information seeking. So when we think about, sorry about that. So when we're supporting students to make sense of the information that they find in our classes, and this includes both the content and the curriculum we share, as well as even instructions for our assignments and activities and expectations for class engagement. We know that learning communities and social belonging are so important to help a student feel welcome and engaged in a learning space. And these are, these learning communities are especially needed in supporting minoritized students. We know that in general, that the fear of stereotype threat is much more prominent with racial minorities or first-generation students. We know that students from low socioeconomic backgrounds are much more likely to withdraw effort, particularly if there's a language barrier, and therefore they're often more likely to avoid information or seek information. So we know all these things in general, but in terms of the current context, we also have a lot of data, right? So we know there's a couple of webinars that I put in the resource list. So Drs. Harris and Wood talk of how students who are facing food insecurities are less likely to feel a sense of belonging with faculty, and they're less likely to feel welcomed or to seek help proactively. Not only that, those who are facing house insecurities are also struggling with help seeking. So what does this mean for us, right? So I was thinking about this a lot recently, and I'm kind of visual. I like to create diagrams and models for myself. I have a notebook and I just kind of draw things out and connect things together. For me, when I think of students and instructors, and I think of these things that we have to make sense of together, right? So we have these information tools and we have these information objects such as assignment or activity instructions. Not only that, we have this greater context where we're making sense of things together, we're building community, we're seeing identities, and we're setting high expectations and setting students up for success. So how do we do all that? Let's see, I have this information. When we think about that in terms of COVID-19, we know that this idea of building community and making sense and seeing, and all of these kind of things are even more pertinent now, right? We know that we're in a new online environment. We know that we know that in this environment, in the pandemic, in particular, racial and ethnic minorities are some of the most impacted already by inequities that are already in place systemically and institutionally, but that is more exacerbated by this pandemic, right? And as I was watching, Cora Learning's webinars from and looking through the data, and we can clearly see that underserved students are often facing issues of digital access, basic needs insecurities, campus resources and information access. On top of that, they have anxieties, fears, feelings of overwhelm born from job instability, sheltering in place, the health of ourselves and those around us. Basically, our work, school, and home lives are all mixing together without any structures or support. And that's why, as instructors, one thing we can be sure to do is structure and design our classes and our learning spaces intentionally, so that students feel that this learning space is one where they are secure, welcomed, engaged, and seen. So those are some things I'm thinking of. I see in the chat people are like, okay, so what exactly can we do, practically speaking in teaching? And I think because this is new for me as well, these are just some ideas that I've had and that I've seen. So these are a couple of things that I've shared. For example, when you are structuring, I was talking about this with someone as people were coming in, when we're structuring things like Canvas announcements or discussion boards, if you're making your Canvas announcements, are you doing it at the exact same time every single day, right? Are you building in this practice where students are comfortable and have a routine for where they check for information and when they check for information? That's kind of important, right? Are we thinking about communication tools that are responsive to students' ways of knowing? So are they comfortable with things like email? Do they prefer texting? Is there an option for you to use a Google Voice number, depending on the size of your students, that kind of thing? Are they comfortable with texting instead? Being intentional responding. There's having periodic check-ins, like the study hall idea that we were talking about earlier, with having some music and just having a consistent space where students can always come to and just work on their laptops, and you're there as well, and they can ask you questions if they want, or they can just do their homework, that kind of thing. Overall, really focusing on this idea of creating community. And there's so many different ways to do that. Unfortunately, it is about almost 5 minutes to 1:30. So
Can I interrupt 1 sec? You've had,
yeah.
Carlos does have a question that he's been waiting to ask you. Perhaps you
Yes.
have time for that. Carlos, you still?
Yeah,
around?
I'm still here. There's this issue of inclusivity, this idea of how do we create this environment, this equitable environment within the classroom. One of the things I found, the classes I teach, there are times when trying to develop an equitable classroom means that some students, especially those in dominant racial groups, have got to be shut down. So how do you create this type of equitable classroom in a way that it isn't as though you just open the classroom up and these diverse voices, that the issue of racial dominance is still there. So so how do you, I haven't found a good way to deal with that in a classroom except case by case. So how do you transfer that to Canvas? How do you make sure that dominance, either in terms of race or gender or sexuality or class, doesn't filter into the discussion, doesn't filter into the community? That's one of the struggles I have. And if you are equitable, do you not have to kind of reduce then the access to people in the dominant groups in certain cases in order to increase access to the people in the marginalized groups?
I think I have two thoughts. One is this idea of, again, with the making sense, what expectations are we making explicit in terms of participation with things like discussions on a Canvas discussion board. So do we have these expectations, and are we laying out how we expect people to participate? So if we design a discussion board to say, in your post, I want you to give 1 sentence about these things, 2 sentences about these, or I want you to reply to the person after you. I want you to come in on Monday to write your post, and I want you to come in on Wednesday to write a response or something. Are we making those kind of structures? I also think about this idea a lot about, this is both with online and face-to-face, this idea of democratizing discussion. So I think about this I had this experience when I was a graduate student, and I was in this seminar class, and all of us were very eager, but it was a very large class. There were about 40 of us, and the instructor, she really cared about social justice. She thought she was very equity-minded. But for her, equity-minded in discussion meant having open discussions and letting people just talk. And through that, people will share their voice the way they want to share their voice. Now, what that meant was for students like me who are socialized into not competing with others to raise our voice and to talk, that meant I would wait and listen to everyone first before I felt it was okay for me to speak. Over time, there were a few of us in the class. Over the time in the quarter, she would start making comments like, because she was actually assigning participation points with how active she felt we were in discussion as well. So she would say things like, I know you guys don't really care in the middle, or, if you really want your points, you really should speak up now, without realizing that, the people in the front who come from these dominant cultures are much more willing to speak out. So I would read a lot of articles, and there's a couple that I can maybe include. I didn't include them in the resource list because they weren't relevant to this particular topic, I felt, but I can include about things that other teachers have done to democratize their discussions in those ways. So things like being very explicit about what roles people have in small group discussions, or being explicit with who they want to call without, thinking, I'm just thinking about all these ways, but I realize it's 129. So maybe I'll just throw some of those resources in the list. Does that sound okay, Carlos?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's just like when you talk about that grad class. I remember I took a class, I think, very similar to yours in the way. It was sociology. We were study students. So there was this conflict, right, between the two disciplines already. And at the midterm, the professor sat there and said, are you having any problems in the class? I said, yeah, every time American Studies students speak up, the sociology students shut us down. And that question was, what can I do to make it better? And I put, quit participating in it. Because she was actually supporting the sociology students shutting down the American Studies in this place that she thought she was a very equitable-minded instructor, giving everybody a chance. So part of me is like, how do you set these guys? Because I've kicked students out. I've told students, get out of my classroom. You are not allowed to say that kind of stuff in this classroom. So if you're going to talk this way, and if you're not going to apologize, if you're not going to change, you're out of here. And there are times that you just can't, create that equitable space in the way that I think we dream about. And so that's the struggle, I think. Teaching race and ethnicity the way I do, it's a difficult line to pull. And again, I don't know how you pull it off online. How do you kick somebody out of the classroom? You can't do the discussion forum anymore. What do you do? That's the struggle.
Yeah, engagement is a whole new scene now in online environment. I do realize it's 1:31. So for those of you who do need to go, thank you so much for being here. I did put my email back up on the screen if you'd like to take a look. And if you want to provide feedback, that's really awesome. For Carlos, if you want to stick around, we can have a conversation about that a little more. I actually have a librarian meeting right after this, but
no, we can talk. But I mean, I'm glad I would like to spend, I mean, when things open up some time
Mhm.
with you,
Mhm.
just and talk, because I almost did my dissertation on critical pedagogy. I do a lot
Yes.
of work in critical pedagogy, and I have this idea about the pedagogy of healing that
Mhm.
I'd like to get some ideas from you, what you think about this thing, and how do we create the pedagogy of learning, the critical self-consciousness to a healing process? How do we heal the colonial wounds that so many of our students suffer from? Rather than just exposing the wounds themselves or the causes of the wounds, how do we get the students to heal from those wounds? So if you're
Yeah.
willing, I'd like to talk to you about that.
Yeah, please send me an email. I would love to. I love thinking about these things. Um, yeah, I have a lot of thoughts
Yeah,
and probably not a lot of time to share them.
yeah. See, I wrote my dissertation on hope,
That's
on
amazing.
what hope
Yeah.
is, and so yeah. Go ahead. I'll email you, and maybe there's
Mhm.
a time that we can set up to talk about this thing when we both have time and you're not running off to a meeting. Okay.
That'd be
Thank you again
wonderful.
for that. I really enjoyed. Yeah, I didn't
Yeah,
expect to enjoy this, but I really did. So thank you.
that's great.
Okay. Yeah.
Please email me.
Okay.
I'm
Bye
looking
bye.
forward to it. Yep.
I will. Bye.
And thank you as well to everyone in the comments. If you do have, I sincerely apologize with the time constraint. If you do want further conversations, I love coffee and I love tea, and I'm getting to love Zoom. It's not bad. So please email me if you would like to have a conversation. I'm always ready to make time for this kind of thing.
Hi, Amanda.
Yeah.
My name's Jake. I'm from the biology department at Green River, and
Mhm.
I'm just interested if you've done any work in terms of the sciences and STEM and how to create
Mm.
inclusive pedagogy there, because it's definitely something that I want to aim for more. I talk a lot about the issues in STEM with including women and people of color
Mhm.
throughout the history of science. But I haven't seen any real good studies or work. I mean, I haven't looked enough, obviously, but really good studies or work on how to create inclusive pedagogy for scientific fields. So I was wondering if you had any ideas, or if at some point maybe you were thinking about doing another one of these, but more STEM focused. I would love
Mm.
to see that.
That would be interesting because I would love to read more literature on that. So I only have the two articles that I think of. One is kind of like action research that was focused in math, and both of them are an assessment. So it's about inclusive pedagogy and designing assessment in class. So one is math and it's a university setting, and another is biology in a high school setting. So if you're interested, I could share those two articles. But I would love to read more because I think, discipline-specific inclusive pedagogy practices are really important.
Yeah, definitely. I would love to see those. I know I've at some point I used to work at University of Washington in the biology department, and they have the BERG, the Biology Education
Mm-hmm.
Research Group. And they've talked a little bit about inclusive pedagogy, but a lot of it was inclusive wording on exams or inclusive wording on
Mm-hmm.
assignments. Making sure that you're representing more people in those terms.
Mm.
And while it's great. I mean, I strive for changing names, like on exams, for example, questions from everyone from Sam and Joe to like make sure that they have more diverse names. I definitely would like to see more in terms of things that we could do in lecture, or the types of topics that we
Mm-hmm.
can cover, and the best ways of covering them, like ways to make people feel more encouraged in STEM, especially coming from minority backgrounds that may have not have had that same types of encouragement. I know I
Mm-hmm.
try to foster it in my classroom, but I'd love to see more techniques and things like that.
Yeah, no, that would be really great. Let's, I got you said you're from Green River, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I have your name and I will email you, and let's do some searching together. Now that I'm thinking about it, I have another article that I think might be in a STEM setting, and it's about like designing discussions, again, with that idea of democratizing the discussion space.
Yeah.
But let me look. Yeah.
Cool. No, that'd be great. Thank you so much, and thank you again for having this. This was really useful.
Oh, good. I'm glad. Thank you for being here, Jake.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. I think we should save the chat at this point.